Okay, thank you everybody for joining. Starting off, the purpose of this was to talk about back to practice and also to provide our doctors a checklist with respect to how they approach preparing their business for reopening, which it's anybody's debate as to the timing of it, but nonetheless, the preparation is essential. So the background to this is that Medimatch and ourselves, who between us have about 3,000 clinicians and do over 100,000 cases a year, pretty much when the lockdown started in China, I spoke to Hugo, who's the owner of Medimatch, and we started to think about what could we do from our vantage point to enable our clinicians to return swiftly and safely to work. So the goal of this webinar is the next slide. Then we're going to move on to lessons learned from COVID-19 and bounce back. And I want to call out Straumann Group as being instrumental in helping us aggregate this information. Then we have an infection control options and considerations, and then Q&A. What I'll do is I'll get through the presentation. Julian, I'll come back to you, and then you maybe could start with just giving a little bit of a précis of your own background, and then we can take it from there. So Medimatch and ourselves teamed up about 5-6 weeks ago, and the outcome of that is how can we add value to our clients, and we came down with these three things, which find a way to share knowledge, find a way to aggregate the provision, a plan, if you will, of planning points and checklists to reopen successfully, which is a document that you can download after this. And then obviously source expert guidance. Now, you'll appreciate I'm not a dentist, but nor a technician, but in the same vein, there's a huge amount of information flying around, and Julian very kindly agreed to give some sort of direction to that. The paper that you can download after the webinar is the checklist paper, and it covers these themes. Now, some are obvious in what you would do in the practice, and some are less obvious. But I'm not going to go into that today. I really want to go through the lessons learned bit, because it's a substantial amount of, I believe, very valuable insights for our doctors. So sorry, I'm going to go back one. I want to particularly thank Straumann and Petra Rumpf. And the background here is that Petra, on behalf of Straumann, orchestrated a weekly conference call with the chief executives and the executive teams of the largest DSOs in Europe. So in the UK, that would be Bupa, My Dentist, Roderick's, Portman, and Colosseum, and their counterparties from across several countries in Europe. So in that respect, this is very biased towards the way they see the world, but in another respect, it's very useful for any private independent principal to understand their thinking and their approaches. So let's get into COVID and lessons learned. And it builds up on obviously starting with putting it into perspective, then the learnings from China, the potential long-term implications, and if I can move my box, planning. So what's on the right is something just to kind of resonate with people. Prior to, excuse me, I'm just trying to make my picture disappear. There you go. So I can see everything myself. This was some research that McKinsey and BCG, Boston Consultancy Group, were mandated to look at the impact of this pandemic across the sector. And one of the things they pulled out, just to kind of drive the point home, is that prior to 9/11, the reality is on the left, which is very few bags were checked. There was no such concept as a Sky Marshal, and the threat register that they monitored actively was very low, small beer by today's comparisons. And the point being made here is that things changed, and they changed permanently. and that was their new normal with regards to security in airline traffic. Well, moving to the points being made, I'm not going to read everything out here. I'm going to take you through what I believe are the salient points to kind of register, and then we'll move into more detail. For me, the second point is a very important point, which basically that business disruption, and for those of you who've ever studied it, as I certainly have in my career, is that it does fast track and amplify key emerging trends. And that's something that resonates from the research and feedback from the DSOs, as well as the survey results that were done in Asia. It also means a new normal will materialize, resulting in changed behaviors and expectations. I think those two things are very important to bear in mind. But right up front, there are two macro trends, which I will go into more detail about further into the pack. There is a very significant shift towards digital dentistry, and it doesn't mean adopting an iOS in and of itself. It's wider than that. It's around patient management platforms, online channels, tele-dental consultations, again, using what we're using right now, which is video conferencing. The second thing that really resonates right through everything the research has surfaced is this area of trust. It's vitally important, going back to business, that you take the building and the sustaining of trust. And it isn't just about the patients, it's equally important for the staff members. And of course, time and speed is another factor. You can read what's on in detail, but basically the DSOs as a collection had three questions. When will things return to normal? Sort of timeline. What will the new normal look like, and how should I respond now during the lockdown? What can I do purposefully for me to prepare my business for the bounce back and obviously succeed in attaining the new normal? But it's a little bit more involved than that, and I'll move on. So China came back quite quickly. That's one of the findings post the lockdown. The DSOs in China came back faster than the private clinics. Some DSOs not only came back faster, but they saw the post-COVID or the lifting of the lockdown as an opportunity, and they have increased the patient base post-lockdown. Let's go into more detail on what that actually means in practical terms. This is an important graph. For those of you who have been tracking when the lockdown happened in China, I believe it was the 23rd of January. And then you can see what happened prior to the 23rd of January, business as usual, followed by a series of weeks of lockdown. This yellow piece is me. I highlighted those 3 weeks, specifically because on the calls that I participated on with the DSOs, when they relaxed the lockdowns, they made a conscious decision to ramp up slowly for those 3 weeks because of factors on the ground. And the factor was they did not want to be seen as competing for the PPE equipment that was needed elsewhere. So as far as the graph's concerned, you really should focus on the 16th of March onwards. That's when they went back to business in a fully equipped and without the sort of the concern of competing with the wider supply-demand challenges of PPE equipment. But breaking that down, you'll see that the DSOs actually came back very, very quickly. Essentially elapsed time of about a month from almost normal. And the government, which I imagine is the equivalent of UDA work or similar in the Chinese context, came back quite quickly. But the private independents came back a lot slower. And I think the message here is why and how. Well, this is one of the first things I think the DSOs really focused on, and they did so long before the lockdown was, they took patient engagement super seriously. In other words, they reached out and communicated by text, emails, or teleconferencing with their patients in mid-treatment. They went through their CRM, their book of business, and reached out to people to start to get them briefed in on the steps taken to make sure that attending their surgery was a safe and thing to do, and also to allay any concerns that people would naturally have. And again, that is a really, really strong point throughout the presentation. Basically, don't wait for the lockdown to happen or to be lifted to engage your patients. Do it now. It was what the message is here. How they did it was again, you got to see it in the context of China. They started to use online platforms, perhaps platforms like I'm using now to speak to you. They upped their marketing. They reached out to existing patients, and they started with promotions. The whole thing was to allay any, build trust, deal with concerns and anxieties, and provide people with incentives to come and book in advance of the restrictions being lifted. Again, I'm not going to read everything because you can get this presentation from us after this meeting, after this call. The next big thing was the obvious point, which is infection control. And this was, I've only kept the points that were feedback points from them. It's clearly obvious that it's not just patients, it's associates and your staff. They need to be informed, they need to be briefed, you need to communicate with them. But what came across from the feedback was this was a very important message to push out early, which is safety first. The latter point I think is interesting because it does feed through into the checklist paper, which is the importance of identifying vulnerable groups and then mapping that to how your opening hours operate. So in some cases, people have put aside surgeries that focus on vulnerable groups. Sometimes they have opening hours that are specific to vulnerable groups, or opening days that are specific to vulnerable groups. This slide is what's missing off this slide, which comes out further on, is that an awful lot of activities happen long before the person or the patient presents themselves within surgery, such as questionnaires, online questionnaires to identify people that have had COVID, in which case they may have had a antibody test to prove it, or vulnerable groups. The pictures illustrate standard operating procedures currently in many of DSOs in China, which is they use social distancing, signage, floor markings to keep people separated. The staff are in PPE. They use thermal cameras or temperature gauges to identify people with high temperatures. Clearly, if you're asymptomatic, that is not a silver bullet. The pre-treatment stage, they identify AGP cases and deal with them differently to normal checkups. Obviously, it has an implication on the PPE setup. In the treatment stage, it's obviously the infection control procedures pre and post AGP treatments. Post-treatment, I'm going to go into more detail further on. You'll see how they have nuanced their engagement with clients post or patients post-treatment. And then after hours, there is the protocol of the level of infection control they do in the common areas as well as within the surgeries themselves. The post-lockdown clinics systematically educated patients, which on the full range of preparations taken and adopted. And again, this is about reinforcement and links very strongly to the building of trust and reduction of anxiety. And pre-screening is a standard operating procedure adopted in those countries that have now opened for business. Learnings from China, a couple of other things. The bullet points or feedback points from the survey, and I may have skipped over it, but this survey covered 7,500 clinics. So it's well into the realms of statistical significance. Increased cooperation with suppliers, obviously the building security of protective materials and consumables, and also alignment of their opening for business with those that provide them services. And, you know, I include ourselves in that. I mean, there's not a lot to be good to come out of a opening for business if your lab partner is unaware of it. Employee engagement, again, featured very strongly in this. And I think it's completely understandable, because in the world of COVID, when you've got something with a very high R value and it has a long incubation period, and it is quite a serious illness to get, given, you know, just given the data that's out there, it's vitally important that staff concerns and associate concerns, and all clinical staff particularly, but all staff in general, understand how the practice is taking purposeful steps to assure that they're working in a safe environment. Again, there's more detail I need to go into. Finance would obviously play a big part. The UK is quite different in the sense that there are schemes and mechanisms here that I assume most people will take advantage of or have taken advantage of. There's not a lot to be said other than the obvious, is that 90+% of the revenues ceased during lockdown, and it's really important to measure and manage cash very tightly for some time to come. These are quotations. I've deliberately highlighted two because I think they resonate the most. Online consults to patients during lockdown. Not sure how many of you have done that, but it certainly was a significant trend across the DSOs in the countries that are already open for business. And supply chain and operations, which I'll include your dental lab as one of your operating partners, was equally very important. Getting away from the high level now and moving on to the implications. This slide is actually quite interesting. It's from McKinsey. They were commissioned to do this work. It's very new. What's interesting in the dark blue line is you can see that China is bouncing back quite strongly. It is going to have a GDP impact, but basically the forecast is in Q3 this year, they will have essentially returned to the pre-crisis level. Coming down to the Eurozone, of which UK can be included, it's looking to be Q1 of next year. When I read this report, the bit that really stood out for me was, again, the bit I've highlighted in yellow, is that the consumer confidence stood stable. And not only stood stable, but it seemed to move to a bias towards overall health and healthy lifestyle. I think that's an important point to understand, because dentistry obviously features in the whole panorama, if you will, of healthy lifestyle. And it again comes out in the research a few slides further on. This point backs that up. Again, Boston Consultancy Group did this exercise looking at consumer changes in consumer expectations and habits. And what they've noticed is that the concept of preventative healthcare, healthy lifestyle, has come up the rankings quite significantly. And as you probably all appreciate, is that there is a higher order of preventative healthcare, which is proactive healthcare, and in a digital world, some of the packages and software that are used in iOS are designed around being able to identify more than preventative, but more proactive. But it's interesting to see that this is a significant shift in the consumer priorities, if you will. And it's backed up by what's happening online. So not surprisingly, because during lockdown, you've had a lot more people signing up to courses, streaming, entertainment, using more commercial banking, using more community groups and commerce groups. But notwithstanding the growth in those areas, the one that has outstripped all of them has been online consultation in the healthcare sector, of which dentistry is featured very strongly. There is an underlying reason for this, is that in the post-COVID world, you can see there's an additional cost in PPE, but there's also a constraint on how many patients you can get through your practice on a given day. It takes more time, is basically what seems to be the learning points of coming out of it. To that end, they are trying to adjust their business models to reduce the amount of chair time that is utilized in things that they can quite effectively do remotely or in other ways, such as out of hours. An example of this is this slide. If you look at the top bit where it says from awareness and need, the typical business process would be doctor, clinician would write to you, remind you, you've got, it's time for to make an appointment. The person would make an appointment. There would be a face-to-face visit. There would be an in-person procedure. And typically you'll be rebooked to come back for monitoring or for just a checkup after, say, a restorative treatment. What's shifting is that they're using online platforms to do that for them automatically. They're mining their data, their customer data, to run that as campaigns. They're automating the process by using online triage and booking. In some cases where people are mid-plan, they're able to video conference the person in, talk them through the next steps of their plan rather than have to do it face-to-face. And in selected treatments and procedures, they're, such as in this example, clear aligners and whitening trays, they're trying to keep it out of the surgery, I suppose, is the short answer there. Moving, sorry, there's 4 people in the waiting room. So, yeah. I can get this off my screen. Sorry, everybody, it's things popping up my screen. 85% of the DSOs saw opportunities as well, and where they're focusing their investment dollars or pounds is looking at the e-commerce side of their world. I highlighted the acceleration of the company's digital dentistry transformation. Again, I iterate, it's not iOS in and of itself, it's iOS part of a wider teleconsultation strategy. And the other thing they're looking at is product development, which is, what they mean by that is different additional complementary services in the aesthetic world or in consultations that are chargeable, video consultations that are chargeable. Again, watch that space. Following on, moving down that same list, you see, again, these are the feedback points from the survey: increased investments in channels, a lot more focus on marketing communication with the client, a lot more tighter management of the investment they make in those areas. And they're obviously focusing on rationalizing and reschedule to essentially free up chair time so that surgeries are productive in hands in the mouth treatments that are fee earning. Okay, this is very dense in content, and that's why I recommend you download it. Resolve is all about things you can do now before opening, and return is how you return. These things are tactical. These are short term. They're impactful. The third one is, once you're back to business, is rethinking the business model. And the points underneath are the is an amalgam, if you will, of all of the priorities as understood from the survey, from having surveyed, like I said earlier, 7,500 clinics and the DSO leadership teams. I've highlighted below the Straumann free sign-up. I'm not promoting it, I'm just saying that this is a very good example of knowledge platforms that have been pulled together in pretty short order. And in China, there are a proliferation of these. I have excluded them from this presentation because the slides would have gone on forever. The third one on that list was reimagine your strategy. And there's a few things I've highlighted. One is obviously cost of finance is at a historical low, and I don't see that changing. I think also a fragmented supplier portfolio is not good for business. I think you have to identify your suppliers that give you certainty, and certainty has its own value. And it's an opportunity to look at your spend outside the practice and with whom, and making sure that they're going to be around for the long term. The new patient acquisition resonates in the sense that stay in contact with your patients during lockdown is a clear message throughout the research, and do something about it, such as schedule patients proactively before opening, and provide confidence over the phone, by email, and by your triage protocol to make sure that you are able to identify people that are post-COVID, people that are vulnerable, and align those cohorts appropriately with your PPE usage and how you schedule your weekly surgery schedules. Again, you can download this, but this is sort of heads up on what the new normal is likely to look like. It involves heavily around regulating patient demand and safety and care, the use of digital, secure supply, and of course, your team needs to be motivated, focused, so that they're able to apply the new standing operating procedures, and not only just apply it, but monitor and manage it actively, so that the outcome of really tight infection control is tangible and credible to both staff and patients. This is a list of temporary operational measures to build trust with patients and staff to drive that point home. Again, once you download it, you can size it up for how it maps onto your own practice. That said, the checklist paper will be available, which I think will be a little bit more structured and probably more useful in practice. Patient expectations. Now, at the very beginning of the presentation, when you had the 9/11 analogy, one of the things that came out from the research from disruptions in the past, so this is not specific to COVID, it's just the learnings from epidemics and significant disasters in the past, like Fukushima's nuclear reactors failing, was that disruptions bring about or fast track irreversible changes in expectations. And these are the headlines that are coming out from the research. So it's moving the relationship with your patients away from short-term to long-term appointment planning, including all treatment steps. And that is a hard thing to do in the old way. You can do it very sophisticatedly by using apps, by using webinars or teleconferencing with them. Medical history, vitally important to check it and validate it, and for everybody's sake, the patients, your staff. And One of the things I found really telling was the fourth point, which was this move towards specialization. Rather than going into in detail, I'm going to go on to a slide to emphasize why that stood out for me. And it's this reason. Boston Consultancy Group and the Henderson Institute did a data analysis of the Standard & Poor's, and they looked at shocks to systems, economic systems, going back a long way. And in broad terms, irrespective of the nature of the shock, whether it's the 1929, Wall Street crash, whether it's SARS, whether it's MERS, N1H1, whether it's Fukushima, there were winners and losers who fell into a 2x2 quadrant, the classic consultancy quadrant. And what it basically said is that not far off half did nothing. And because they did nothing, the 44%, they saw revenues fall and their profits fall. The 28 are actually people who saw the revenues fall, but the profits went up. And that in the research says that they got very specialized. So they made more profits, but did less work, and they became quite specialized, or they broadened their portfolio that allowed them to specialize. And the 14% that's beside the green 14% are people that basically worked harder, but made less profits. The feedback from it was stress test your financials, resize your organization to the extent that the financials dictate, take partnerships seriously, act early and fast, and adopt only the changes that drive growth. In other words, any pet projects or any things you're thinking about doing, if they do not in the short term generate strong contribution to overheads at the very minimum, or have complement your existing portfolio of services, think again. But invest to grow. When the dust settles, don't give up and don't stop. Reimagine the long-term shape of what business you're in, and adjust and adapt to the new normal. And this new normal, again, I emphasize, is around new expectations from patients. And indeed, depending on your service portfolio, they may be less patients, they could be equally consumers in the aesthetic side of things. And the last thing was, every disruption opens up an enduring, irreversible trend. And it seems very, very, very obvious from what's happened in the countries that have opened, is that they've really embraced digital as a generic change in their business. And within that context, iOS has a role to play. I would envisage iOS as something that would enable consultations to be a lot more effective, because you can share the screen with your patient, you can talk them through the treatment plan, the design can be done, you can see the before, the middle, and the after, and things like that. I was not going to include this, but I'm not going to labor the point. We have had, in not too distant memory, 3 noticeable disruptions, 2 epidemics and 1 very serious disaster. They're not on the scale of COVID, clearly, but what it does illustrate is that there is a bounce back. And what this presentation, when you read it in detail, is that the bounce back, even for those that are through it now, happened quicker than they planned for. And the summary of this is very simple. Clearly, it's a pandemic is going to, with a huge amount of uncertainty with respect to its size, its duration, and the profile. But bounce back was faster than planned for, which I think is encouraging. The impact did create irreversible shift in preferences and expectations of employees and patients, especially in respect to safety, but not only in respect to safety. It also means that your patients are increasingly digital by default. In other words, they're quite at home using apps online booking systems, online triage questionnaires, follow-up, post-treatment consultations, again, online or on smart devices. It's really emphasized in the adoption rate in the Asia region of online in general, and particularly channels and iOS. But overall, the biggest feedback is that resonates very, very strongly in all the research is this word trust. And it is about removing high levels of anxiety and concerns for patients and staff. Yeah. And reinforcing it long after the distancing measures are lifted. DSO is expected to re-emerge stronger, and readiness equals speed to benefit from the bounce back. I'm going to now get to a Q&A, and I want to invite Julian, if you can take Julian off mute, to introduce himself, and any questions, we'll field them. Julian?
Hi, can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Yep.
Marvellous. Are you going to field the questions? How do you want to do this?
Well, I think if you could just give a little bit of background, Julian, and your involvement in this COVID-19.
Okay, well, firstly, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for asking me to come on the call. So I'm a dentist, still practice. I've been practicing for more than 30 years. I've been involved in all areas of sort of the business of dentistry, from corporate, where I ran a small group. It's really not about me, this, so we'll keep it quick. I was involved with Oasis from 2011 to 2017, and I'm now part of the My Dentist team. I joined in 2018 specifically to offer support to Tom Ryle, who was then the new chief exec. I think that's probably as much as anyone wants to hear about my background. I've since this pandemic, I've been quite heavily involved with sections of the NHS Public Health England infectious diseases unit at the John Radcliffe Hospital, which is one of the review centres in Oxford, and been supportive in creating some of the documentation that Straumann have used for DSO publications. That's being disseminated further, so that's presentation is available. Dermot, I believe you've got the presentation, which is sent to you, which has been re-edited to be appropriate for all dentists, because this is an all dentist situation, not a DSO situation. And I've been fortunate enough to be involved in seminars and discussions. I was on with the American DSO group a couple of days ago, and there were about 3,500 practitioners, not just dental service organisations on that, and a number of the European meetings. I think the last Straumann European meeting, there was something in the region of about 2,000 I can't remember, quite a lot of people. So it's quite clearly topical, and one of the reasons that I got together with Straumann is to try and demystify some of the issues that surround the profession, and some of the elements of fear, which is naturally there are concerns around COVID. We have to remember that COVID is not a new virus. It's simply this strain 19, which is jumped species, which has caught us on the hoof. And I think there are key things to remember, that 80% of people that get COVID-19 only have mild symptoms. So, you know, I think some of the challenges, we all seem to be listening to the media, we all seem to think that if you get COVID, you're going to go straight to intensive care. And I think some of that just needs to be demystified a little bit. So that's kind of what I've tried to do. I don't set myself up in any way, shape or form as an authority. I'm not trying to tell dentists what to do. What I'm trying to do is distill out information which comes from multiple sources, including China, South Korea, the States, Germany, Poland, Turkey. You know, we have a frequent daily dialogue between colleagues to to try and find out what people are doing, what they find works, what the latest research is. So that's kind of what I've been doing in lockdown, and hopefully I'm able to share some of that with you.
Julian, I'll ask a question. I mean, what are your views on AGPs, and where do you think the world's going? What's the direction of travel?
So the whole question of aerosol generating procedures took on a life of its own right at the beginning of COVID. There was this automatic leap in assumption that aerosol generating procedures would increase substantially risk to dental practitioners, because the incorrect assumption was that aerosol generating procedures would have the same contamination risk as, for example, a COVID-19 positive patient coughing in your face. And there are studies, and one study which is due to be published, I think Thursday of this week, is actually looking at viral load in saliva versus the load that you get from the depths of the lungs of a heavily infected individual. And so the early indications are that the viral load in saliva, there are precautions that, as common sense precautions, can be applied to reduce risk, but also with things like high volume aspiration, external high volume aspiration units, visors, masks, etc. This risk can be brought down. So the only thing I'd say with, yes, there is an increased risk. We don't know what the increased risk is. What is becoming clear is the risk of aerosol seems to have taken on a life of its own, in the sense that everyone now is terrified of aerosol, as opposed to, and I think people have made the jump between, a cough and droplets versus aerosol, which is composed of, water from the triple syringe, water from the turbine, saliva, tooth debris, etc. Not saying there's no risk with aerosol, but there are things that we as practitioners can do to mitigate that risk.
So on that point, I mean, the Dentios out of Belgium shared an interesting piece of, internal research looking at, they made the point that, perfection in infection control is an illusion. What they meant by that was you have to take a holistic series of steps end to end to up the infection control or reduce the infection control risk. It's not a matter of one thing will do everything, because there's a lot of things flying out and around the internet about UV light, UVC light, or UV-Far light, and hydrochlorous and misting machines to air purifiers. What do you see a standard practice, minimum standard, might develop into in routine treatments?
So I think it's a difficult one. I have got a list of things that that I've made a list of that suggestions of what makes sense. I think what you do have to be mindful of is that everywhere you look now, there's an opportunity to buy another special filter or bit of kit coming in from abroad. Some of it is very good, some of it is very expensive, and it's quite a difficult minefield, I think, for people to navigate. Shall I walk through? Would it be helpful if I walked through a sort of practice scenario, and then I would allow anyone on the call to raise questions around whether they thought that was appropriate or not? Would that be helpful?
Yeah, because I've had a few suggestions from other dentists. One of them was a product called Radic 8.
Yeah.
Which is like a virus. I think the problem we're going to have is being able to decontaminate the surgeries as quickly as possible, because you're going to have a massive influx of patients and waiting for maybe 45 minutes for it to. But apparently, Radic 8 will clear the room in 15 minutes. So I don't know. Do you have any experience with that?
Yeah, I do. So I'm aware of Radic 8. And Radic 8 is a Korean product. It's very good. It's a high volume aspiration unit. I think it clears the volume of air in a room or in kind of 5-10 minutes. I mean, it's got a viral sterilization unit built into it, and then it gets rid of the air to the outside.
Yeah.
Would I buy one? The answer is no, I wouldn't. There's nothing wrong with the system. They are. You have to consider the cost implications of buying one versus the benefit. So what it won't do is it won't clean the room. We just need to be clear. What it will do, it'll take anything that's airborne and suck it through the filters, and it's a highly effective hospital-based system. That's where it was initially designed for use on that basis. And they're great bits of kit. As I said, they're not inexpensive. But what they don't do is they don't do anything for the work surfaces. Right, so they only do the air. If it's landed on the work surface, it won't suck it off the work surface and put it through the pipe. So I think, when I've looked at all of this, what probably one of the most important elements in managing of patients is something happened to the screen then. I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
It bounced, didn't it? So one of the key things is actually filtering the patients at the triage stage. It's actually the pre-screening of patients before they get in, and there is a very detailed patient question and answer triage piece that has been worked up by a number of colleagues, which allows you to pretty effectively, there's no guarantees, but pretty effectively be able to screen the patients. And it's that primary screening of the patients that affords the greatest level of protection for colleagues, for work colleagues, receptionists, staff members, etc. I'm not saying that the machine that we're talking about isn't a good machine. What I'm saying is, where is it in the balance of cost-benefit ratio?
Exactly. There are so many machines that have been put out to us, and we're having to make a decision, and we don't want to actually buy the wrong machine, spend a load of money on something that's can turn out to be ineffective.
Yeah, and considering all that, none of us have been making any money for quite a long time, and when we go back, there won't be a lot of money coming through either. Because if you talk to the Chinese data and Dermot's presentation, so it's absolutely right. You've got 90% of practices in China back to work. What was missing from the Straumann presentation is the actual number of dentists that have gone back to work in those 90% of practices. And then you need to look at the number of patients going through those practices during the working day and the practices. All of the stuff that I've looked at across multiple countries who are ahead of us seems to indicate that if we went back on the 1st of July, and I hope we go back earlier than that, realistically, from a business perspective, you can expect to be seeing perhaps no more than 25% of the volume of patients initially, as that you were seeing.
Yeah.
So you'll need to cut your cloth in practice, or we will need to cut our cloth in practice accordingly, and there will be a gradual build-up. And I shared with Dermot the presentation that I did for Straumann, which talks about the stages of recovery. And certainly for those of you who don't want to get bored, the slides to read are sort of, I think, 24 to 30. So skip to the back here. It's like reading the conclusion in a medical journal. Most of us just read the conclusion. But those slides are the key slides which talk about the stages and how the stages might be phased along with what government is saying about social distancing and when groups can come together. Because there would be no point in us using, for example, FFP3 masks or FFP2 masks and the whole paraphernalia when all the pubs, clubs and restaurants are open. So we've got to balance all of this stuff against that which is appropriate and protects the dentist, protects our teams primarily, and I make no apology for saying that, and then secondarily the patients, because if we don't look after our teams, we haven't got anyone to look after the patients. So no. I do kind of make that distinction.
I was just trying to reply to Steve that currently pre-24th lockdown, I thought that our cross-infection procedures were very, very good, and so far, touch wood, none of my patients or my staff come down with this virus. So why can't we actually just return to work doing non-AGP procedures or perhaps set one surgery aside to have all the equipment in there to do the AGP procedures in that particular surgery.
I'd say there's no reason why that isn't a perfectly sensible response. I think one thing that we just need to consider, though, is what is an aerosol generating procedure. But temper with that, the bit that I just said, where aerosols they've been demonized. They're not quite as bad for us as we see. You know, we've made the leap. Saliva, mouth, aerosol, equating to the same degree of risk as infected patient coughing up viral droplets, which then pass into the airway of the dentist or the dental surgery assistant. So, but there's quite a lot to be said for routine consultations, non-aerosol generating procedures.
There's a lot of patients who are going to want crowns re-cemented. They're going to want temporary fillings. All that can be done without generating an aerosol. But unless, as you said, the patient just coughs in your face.
Yeah, and again, we're down to triage. Let me run through. I made the suggestion. Shall I run through where I think common sense is on this?
Yeah. And then it's about common sense.
Yeah, that's where I'm trying to get to with this. So, as I say, take all this on board and have a little look at slides 24 to 30 in the thing that Dermot will send you. But where my thinking is, when I use the word "my," I mean the collective thinking of the people I've talked to in Europe and the States and God knows where else. So in reception, screens help in reception, and gloves and a standard mask, not an FFP2, just a standard mask screen. There's all sorts of discussions about hand sanitation. You can do that or not. Possibly a good idea, but again, it's about, because you pre-screen the patient before they come in. So they come into reception, but you've done the pre-screening and the update of medical history and what are you coming in for and all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah.
And broadly, and you have right at the very beginning, so the first day we go back, you still apply social distancing, probably avoid the waiting room and send the patient straight into, Dr. Smith's surgery. You try and avoid getting people to congregate. There's quite a lot of evidence that says, but it's all subjective and anecdotal, to say that when the patient comes into the room, there is a perceived benefit of using something like heavily diluted hydrogen peroxide mouth rinse for 20 to 30 seconds to reduce contamination.
Yeah, I think peroxide's got the right amount of hydrogen peroxide in it.
Yeah, the only reason I don't make the point of peroxide is you can buy hydrogen peroxide. You can probably buy 5 litres of hydrogen peroxide for the same price as 1 bottle of Peroxil because it's a brand. But I mean, dentists will choose what they choose. And the key thing is you only need a capful of the stuff, not a beaker. Because if you get through beakers, you'll burn miscellaneous cost, and it might not seem a lot for one person, but if you do it every day, and it becomes part of a protocol, these things do add up, and a lot of dental practices have felt an awful lot of financial pain. So you do need to keep an eye on the pennies, so the pounds can stay protected. In non-aerosol generating procedures, visor. I'm going to go out on a limb here. Standard mask. You might in a surgery where you have a window. If you look at the Chinese data on this and the South Korean data, they advocate throwing the windows open and let the air come in. If you have a surgery which doesn't have natural ventilation in there, you might want to consider an air filter of some description. But there is a wide range of air filters on the market, and some are very good, and some are very good and cheap, and some are very good and expensive. And there's some talk about having UVC light units to kill the virus. I'm kind of relaxed about most of that. What you need is a filter which is a HEPA filter, 3 micron. Now, the virus is actually 1 micron. So you might say, well, hang on a second, if it's a 3 micron filter, how is that going to filter the virus? The answer to that, which I can take you through the science of, but we don't think we got that long, is a 0.1 micron coronavirus doesn't fly in a straight line. It's too light. So what happens is there's a I can't remember the name of the principle. It's a bit like atoms bouncing around a room. They bounce around in flight, so they eventually get stuck in the filter. And people have raised the question about, yes, but it doesn't kill it in the filter, it stays in the filter. And the answer is that the virus has a life cycle anyway, so it will eventually die in the filter. The biggest risk is when you come to change the filter. The filters tend to be changed every 6 months, and maybe over the crisis you do it every 3 months. You certainly wouldn't change the filter more than that. And if you're worried, I'd simply, don your FFP2 mask and gloves and whatever for the filter changing procedure. But I think there's also the thing that needs to be considered just purely from the customer facing piece, which is, patients might like to see a filter with flashing lights in the room demonstrating you're doing something else. The one thing that I didn't...
building patients' confidence in you that you're actually doing something. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Julian, but
no, at all.
Getting back to the HEPA filters, is there a way to actually convert your normal air conditioning into something that's more effective?
I can't purport to be any kind of expert on air conditioning, so I wouldn't like to say. The advice that's coming out of places like China and others during the beginning of the phase is leave your air conditioning off. I do not run air conditioning until such time as social distancing has been relaxed. That's the guideline.
Okay, so air conditioning off.
Yeah, because otherwise...
Windows open.
Windows open, air conditioning off, and where you don't have the ability to throw the windows open, you may wish to consider some sort of inexpensive filter system. And I stress inexpensive. It wants to be an air filtration that does HEPA 3, has HEPA filters in it, but there's, UVC is banded around a lot. UVC is great, but UVC in the context of disinfection or stroke sterilization, really that comes about when you put UVC robots into hospitals that run around on a pre-programmed circuit at night when nobody else is in the hospital, and the UVC rays sterilize operating rooms and theatres and rooms, but they have people sensors on them. So if somebody walks in the room, the thing shuts down. So the reality is it's not practical in our world to have robots running around our surgery at night. One thing I think is worth pointing out is you do need to have a few protocols, including ones that are written and given to any staff that come from the outside in. So cleaners, for example, they just need to have a protocol for making sure that they clean the common parts but don't clean surgery rooms. So if they did clean your surgery room, for the time being and until social distancing is completely back, you probably want to leave that to the domain of members of the team who clean the surgery.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Hopefully that was helpful.
Yeah, no, it's great. Sorry, I didn't mean to hijack it. Let's go back over to Dermot on mute.
Yeah, I'm back. Back in the room, as I say. Sorry about that. We had our internet went down in the area. It just bounced back again. But I did dial in and hear most of that discussion. From the presentation, was there any? Obviously, it's when you download it, and particularly download the checklist, there'll be a lot more detail in it. But was there any particular learnings that stood out for any of the participants?
Well, I've screenshotted a lot of it, and I shall read it again in the morning. Okay. But I think the go-home message about sort of being in contact with your patients, especially from my experience, spent the whole week at the practice, phoning as many of my sounds selfish, but my practice plan patients who are actually still contributing financially to the practice, and also patients who I know who are in temporary restorations with complex treatment, just checking they're all okay is a massive go home message, really.
Yeah, yeah. Do you anticipate? We don't know when dentistry will, and at what pace dentistry will be allowed to go back or start the journey towards new routine treatments. But if it was, for argument's sake, a given day next month, is your intention, and I'm asking this to everybody really, is your intention to be up for business in that day, open?
Well, my intention would be, I have to safeguard my family, and if I'm going to go back into intrepid environment, then I might just have to check into a hotel somewhere.
Right.
Okay. But I need to get back to work. I know that patients have work that needs completing. I know there are procedures that I can do that do not involve an aerosol, that they want completing, and they want at least to be able to sort of touch base with somebody, if they've got incredible pain, they need things re-cementing, then yes, I am prepared to go back.
Yeah. What measures do you think are necessary just to manage the flow of patients?
Well, I think we're going to be, rather than level 3 for APG, then at least we can survive with a level 2 for non-aerosol generation procedures.
Yeah.
And if it comes to an extraction rather than an extirpation with a high-speed drill under a rubber dam, then it's going to have to be that way if we haven't got the correct PPE.
Right. So that's a common constraint right now, is securing supplies of appropriate PPE.
It is, as long as we can have it fit tested first, as long as we can have it from a reliable source, then that's a way forward. But we have to look at being able to decontaminate the room in between patients as well, and making sure that we're actually following the NHS UDC SOPs. I'm sorry to use so many acronyms, but that's the way we've got to go.
But that would suggest to me, not being a clinician or a doctor, is that the amount of time and investment in time and in consumables is going to go up considerably, and the productivity of care is going to drop. Absolutely,
and that's why we're really struggling to apply for C-bills, because we don't know what our productivity is going to be in maybe 6 months' time in comparison to our outgoings on the correct PPE.
The bit that I'm struggling with from a lab perspective is twofold. One is clearly the message from this research is that the DSOs bounced back strongly, very quickly, in fact. And not only that, some of them will have enjoyed benefit, if you will, from that bounce back, greater than the independents. The second part is most of my doctors are independents, and obviously our alignment is to, as a lab, is to be open and up for business when they're open and up for business. So we would like to see them as prepared and ready for action, so that they prosper, if that makes sense. So the DSOs obviously got security of PPE. They've obviously applied it very, very well, but they must have done something to drive efficiency out of the utilization of the chairs. And the teledental consultancy is clearly part of that. about freeing up chair time to do treatment, including AGP. Because when you download the pack, you'll see that the percentage in the bounce back, how quickly they got back to implants, which caught my attention. Yeah.
Martin?
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
That was back to me. Okay. I don't know the answer to that, Dermot. I still think that the level of cross-infection that we maintained before this virus came was adequate enough, and I don't see why it shouldn't be. Allow us to actually go back to work.
And can I come in here? It's Julian. Can I support that in that, the brutal reality is we are going to need to get back to normality, whatever that new norm looks like, and we are going to need to get back and see and treat our patients. I think there's a number of key things. One, we need to be ready to get back, and we need to tweak the reception, have a protocol in the surgeries for aerosol and non-aerosol. What some of the DSOs, and I say, this is just stuff that I've gleaned from those that I've talked to, is if you've got a 4-surgery chair, instead of 4 patients arriving at 9 o'clock in the morning, one arrives at, because they're all been pre-triaged, and I can't emphasize enough the importance of the triage the day before. It's probably 90% of the key in staying safe is getting your triage correct. But what they do in the 4-surgery clinic in China is they have a patient comes in at 5 to 9, one at 9, one at 5 past 9, and one at 10 past 9. And the patients go straight into the individual clinical rooms. They don't go into the waiting room. And they try and have a work through so that the patient, because they've triaged the patient, they understand what the patient's in for. And what they also try and do is, longer appointments as opposed to multiple short appointments to get as much as they can do on that particular patient in that time. And I think what we got to do is just be careful not to end up scared of our own shadows. And if you look at the communication passage for this process, social distancing is deemed to be one of the most important. So stay away from people that might have COVID. You'll still put social distancing effective in the practice by staging your patients as they come through. Properly screening your patients, I keep going on about this, is absolutely important. So you reduce the likelihood of having somebody in your chair with active, with COVID-19. You can't absolutely guarantee that because, people can be asymptomatic and walk into your surgery the day after, the morning they become active. But in practical terms, you have to have a practical solution. If you have protocols like simple things in the surgery, like mouth rinse, visor, we're going to use standard masks and gloves for non-aerosol generation. For aerosol generation, I'd like to use FFP3. I'd be gobsmacked if anyone can find any floating out around there. I haven't started my video. Well, I can start my video again. If someone just asked me to put that on, I'll try it again. You don't really want to see my face, do you? But I've done it, and but if I lose signal again, I'll knock it off because I'm in deepest, darkest Devon. But so for aerosol generating procedures, you have a slightly different protocol, and we've discussed the other bit. One thing that's got slightly skirted over on this, which is a point that you made, Dermot. What if there was one big takeaway from the Chinese feedback? It was digital. It was massive. It was bigger than anything else. And that was, video triage with patients. What they're now doing is video consultations with patients who might want implants, aligners, cosmetic. They might want to talk to you about the toothache they've got, etc. So they've evolved very quickly into the practices having a set video consultation route for patients. And I don't think that's ever going to go away. I think that digital revolution has been kicked off by coronavirus, and it will grow. Yeah. And the other thing that was incredibly powerful, which forgive me because I couldn't get sound on this earlier. The other thing that the Chinese have done in a big way is webinars to patients.
Yeah.
To patients, not to colleagues, to patients. And the webinars cover what we're doing, cross-infection control. You can do recorded webinar.
Yeah.
There's all sorts of stuff going on. So there's been a sort of little mini digital revolution that's gone on in the terms of communication. And I think those of us who are looking strongly forward need to take those learnings from people who have found it to be highly effective, you know, and the whole sort of digital marketing, Facebook, Instagram, all that kind of stuff. And of course, we mustn't forget, even though it's got a cost implication, if you look at the business case for intraoral scanning, there is always a business case for intraoral scanning. You know, never more. And I don't have any interest in any intraoral scanner. You know, I'm just a dentist, but intraoral scanning has the benefit of not sending contaminated stuff through the post. You don't give it to your lab.
Totally agree with that.
Pardon?
Totally agree with that.
Totally, good.
Yeah.
I thought you said I don't agree with that. Then.
That's fighting talk.
Yeah, it is the way forward in terms of transmitting information to your laboratory.
Yeah.
And putting some form of proactive just actually being able to what's happened?
Yeah, it broke up a little bit there.
Yeah.
Simon, I got a little bit my own to add that, you know, self-declare I'm very pro-digital because of my business background. I've been in technology all my life, really. And what I do know from a ukdentech perspective is that in January 2019, I think, we were 6%, 8%, somewhere around that, of our cases were digital, as in SDL. And we finished off last year north of 50, and we were on plan pre-COVID to end up north of 70%. And the difference is really dentures, to be honest with you, is, you know, that those prostheses that are not quite there yet in terms of 3D printing, but they certainly are there from a CAD perspective. And the benefit that I see from intraoral scanning is patient education. You can, particularly in restorative, that you can really bring them along with you, and you can engage with them again and more effectively, so that they understand the before and after. And that's one of the gifts of it. But the financial case for me is that whilst we are still in the UK considerably behind countries like Germany and France with respect to the penetration of intraoral scanning on a per capita clinician basis, it is changing very quickly. Now, what does it mean in a post-COVID world for me? One is I am equally nervous about manual impressions coming into the lab and infecting my staff. I'm equally nervous that of us doing collections in the traditional sense, where a driver from ukdentech goes from one practice and ends up, God forbid, taking infection from the previous job they picked up into a completely, you know, sterile practice and creating an infection issue there. So we, the same way as a clinician needs to regard every patient as a COVID risk, or, you know, the default is that you are COVID infectious until further notice, we have to have the exact same protocol internally on every single manual impression. We can't take it on trust that it has been sterilized. By the same token, everything we send out, we have to assure ourselves that we sterilized it as a minimum. Does that make sense?
Dermot, can I just add something here?
Mm-hmm.
I'm probably, and everyone on the call, please take this with a pinch of salt, I'm probably the most commercial person as a dentist that I've met. And some people give that to me as a compliment, and some people give it to me as not a compliment. But just to give you some insight, because for me, intraoral scanners are no-brainers. People just don't know how to use them. So I got involved in a trial for Straumann, with Straumann, a couple of months back, with 4 clinics in Germany. We didn't do it in the UK. And I think you'll probably know where I'm going to go with this, Dermot, because we've tried this in the UK. But 4 clinics in Germany, where it was agreed that those clinics would scan every single patient who came through the door in the clinic, if they'd expressed any interest in implants or straightening of their teeth. Very, very simple protocols.
Yeah.
And every single patient who filled in the medical questionnaire to said they were either interested in implants, wanted to get rid of a denture, and or interested in straightening their teeth, they were scanned. They were scanned by a nurse, call it a TCO, but it was a nurse. And that digital scan was then pushed through into the dentist room so the dentist could talk to the patient about what they'd inquired about. Now, just to give you the feedback on those, it ran for only 2 months, because these scanners were on loan to these dentists to prove a point. The worst performing practice achieved on average 1 scan a week, 1 aligner case a week, because it was mostly aligners this came down to. So they did 8 aligners in 2 months. The best performing practice did 47 cases, of which 9 were implant cases in the same period. And that was really down to the charisma and the sales patter and the chat from the individuals. So, just on that basis, and I take all the points you make about cross-infection control and digital transmission and sharing. With intraoral scanners, they're expensive. Unless, when I'm a dentist, I sit there and think, well, I can take my alginate and I can take my silicone and I get a free posting from the lab, so why should I change? There's no main driver. And I don't believe intraoral scanners are simply there to replace impression materials. They are so much more, powerful when they're used in conjunction with media, marketing, education, promotion, etc., etc. But if you want to make them cost effective, pop over to one of those clinics in Germany, because all of those practices ended up not sending their scanners back. They ended up simply paying.
I think we're coming close to the end. I really appreciate the contribution from everybody. We set out a goal which was obviously biased towards our doctors. We're keen to be aligned with their opening. The digital, I suppose in a perverse way, I'm pleased to see that digital is features in this, because I've always believed in it. I'll leave you with a parting couple of comments from me, which is, we're on the journey to digital. Like I said earlier, 2 years ago, we were single digit in terms of our annual caseload digital. We passed the 50% mark before the end of last year. We're on the track to go to nearly 3/4. Now, what does that mean? Well, what it means for us is more certainty, because with the best will in the world, digital versus manual is that the accuracy levels are not at the same level. And what that translates to is that we get a fit of 99% plus. And what I mean by that is our rework rate, and therefore knock-on effect of callbacks and retakes. It used to be around 6%, and now it's sub 1%. And that translates into a significant time saving for doctors when they have their second appointment for fitting a crown or a bridge. Where maybe historically you booked in half an hour, 45 minutes, because it fits, and it fits for a very simple reason: it's accurate. If there's anything else wrong with it, is probably in the realms of aesthetics, but it's certainly not the fit. That time saving is around chair utilization. And I think the strategy, if I was a practice owner, would be saying, how do I maximize my chair utilization using digital, using consultation, teleconsultation, using different ways and means to keep patients out of the chair or avoid face-to-face where there is a realistic alternative that doesn't compromise the clinical outcome. And again, laboring the point from my perspective is that if I was reviewing a case with my patient online, I'd find it a lot easier to do so if I had a digital scan on my screen, perhaps even share with them to talk through the rest of the plan. I'm not a doctor, I'm just giving you sort of the way I see it. So from our perspective, I hope this has added value, giving you food for thought. I would encourage you to download the paper and the presentation. We would be delighted, obviously, to know when your plan is come back to business, because I want to take my people off furlough and stand up my lab to be ready for you. Thank you.